It's a Friday in July 1973. In a small office in Memphis, Tennessee, a 28-year-old former Marine stares at a number on a piece of paper. $24,000. That's what his company owes the oil supplier by Monday morning, for the jet fuel that keeps his small fleet of planes in the air. The problem is the bank account. There's about $5,000 left in it. Not $5,000 to spare. $5,000 total. On Monday, if the fuel isn't paid, the planes don't fly. And if the planes don't fly, the company is finished. And so is the idea it was built on. The idea was simple. Anything, anywhere overnight. Half a century later, that idea would move the world's commerce on its back. But right now, in this office, it is about 3 days from dying. His name is Fred Smith. And this is how he kept it alive. To understand the office in Memphis, you have to go back to a classroom at Yale. Fred Smith was the son of a wealthy bus line founder, but his father died when he was 4, leaving him a trust fund and not much else. At university, Smith wrote a term paper for an economics class. The argument was strange. America, he wrote, was building a new kind of economy, one running on computers and precision machines and electronics. And that economy would need a new kind of delivery. Not trucks, not the post office. A dedicated air network that could move an urgent part across the country and put it in someone's hands by the next morning. There's a legend about that paper. The story goes that his professor gave it a C, scrawling that the concept was interesting but impossible. Smith spent years gently correcting it. He didn't really remember the grade, he said, and the professor didn't either. But the legend stuck because it captured something true. Everyone who heard the idea thought it couldn't work. The numbers were enormous. The logistics were a nightmare, and the man proposing it was a 20-something with no experience running an airline. He had 2 things going for him. He believed the math, and he was willing to bet everything he owned to prove it. Here's why everyone said it couldn't be done. In the early 1970s, if you needed to ship something fast, your package hitched a ride. It went into the cargo hold of a passenger jet, on whatever route happened to be flying. If the plane went where you needed, great. If it didn't, your shipment got handed off, sat in a warehouse, and crawled toward its destination over days. Nobody controlled the whole journey, so nobody could promise when it would arrive. Smith's insight was to stop hitching rides. Buy your own planes. Fly your own routes. And here was the radical part. Don't fly them directly between cities. Fly every single package, no matter where it's going, to one central hub in the middle of the country. Sort it all there in the dead of night. Then fly it back out at dawn to its final city. It sounds insane. To send a package from Boston to New York, you'd first fly it to Memphis. But run the math, and the madness becomes genius. One hub connecting every city is vastly simpler than every city connecting to every other city. If you're enjoying how this story unfolds, take a second to subscribe. We dig into builds like this one all the time. Because what came next nearly destroyed him before the math could prove him right. To build an airline from scratch, Smith needed money. Not a little money, staggering money. The plan called for a fleet of small jets, a network of trucks, sorting facilities, and hundreds of employees, all running on day one before a single paying customer existed. You couldn't start small. The whole idea only worked at scale. So Smith did something almost no founder had done before. He raised around $91 million in venture capital and bank loans. At the time, one of the largest amounts ever assembled for a new company. He started by putting in his own inheritance, several $1,000,000 from his father's trust. Then he convinced investors to follow. He bought a fleet of small French-built Falcon jets, chosen because they were just big enough to carry cargo, and just small enough to slip under the regulations that governed full-size airlines. For the central hub, he picked Memphis. It sat near the population center of the country. Its weather was mild, so flights rarely got grounded, and its airport had spare capacity nobody else wanted. On paper, it was elegant. A young man had assembled a fortune, a fleet, and a plan to rewire how America moved its most urgent shipments. The investors believed. The math believed. Now there was only one thing left to do: turn it on and find out if anyone actually wanted it. The first attempt was a disaster. In a quiet trial run, the new company sent its planes up to deliver packages and came back with almost nothing to carry. A handful of shipments. The network was built for thousands, so they regrouped, signed up more cities, and tried again for real. On the night of April 17, 1973, Federal Express officially launched. 14 Falcon jets lifted off, fanned out across the country, and gathered up every package the young company had managed to win. They flew them all to Memphis. Workers sorted them in the dark, and at dawn the planes carried them back out for delivery. The grand total that first night, 186 packages, to 25 cities. A network that had cost tens of millions of dollars to build had just moved fewer parcels than a single mail truck. Now 186 packages was actually a start. It proved the machine could run end to end. But it was nowhere near enough to pay for the machine. Every plane that took off burned fuel. Every employee drew a salary. Every night the lights came on in Memphis, money poured out the door. And the customers were coming, but slowly. Far too slowly. The company was a beautifully engineered system bleeding cash from every seam, and the bleeding was about to get much, much worse. Then the world turned against him. In the autumn of 1973, war in the Middle East triggered an oil embargo. Fuel prices exploded. For an airline that lived or died on the cost of jet fuel, it was a catastrophe. Federal Express was already losing more than $1 million a month. Now its single biggest expense was climbing by the week. Smith went back to his investors and his banks for more money. Most of them said no. They had seen the numbers. They had watched 186 packages roll through a $40 million machine, and they were done. At one point, the company was so broke that pilots paid for fuel with their own credit cards. Employees cashed paychecks quickly, before the account ran dry. Smith was selling off planes just to make payroll. He had bet his family fortune, raised one of the largest sums in venture history, and built exactly the system he'd promised. And it was still about to collapse. Which brings us back to that office in Memphis. The $24,000 fuel bill, the $5,000 in the bank. Smith had flown to a meeting with a major investor that very week hoping for a rescue. The investor had turned him down flat. He was now sitting in an airport, out of money, out of options, with a weekend to find a miracle. So he did something no business school would ever teach. Instead of flying home to Memphis, Fred Smith got on a plane to Las Vegas. He took the company's last few $1,000s, the money that was supposed to be untouchable, and he walked into a casino. And he sat down at a blackjack table. Think about what that means. The founder of a company carrying the future of global shipping took its final reserves and bet them on the turn of a card. It was reckless. It was arguably indefensible. And it worked. Over that weekend, Smith turned roughly $5,000 into about $27,000. On Monday morning, the accountants at Federal Express opened the books and found money in the bank that had no business being there. One of them asked Smith where it came from. His answer became legend. The meeting with the investor had gone badly, he said, so what difference did it make? He'd taken the last $5,000, and now they had $27,000. The fuel bill got paid. The planes flew Monday morning. The company lived. But here's the part the legend leaves out. $27,000, against losses of more than $1 million a month, bought him almost nothing. Maybe a week. The Blackjack Hand didn't save Federal Express. It just kept it breathing long enough for the real rescue to arrive. Now for the part of the story that doesn't fit on an inspirational poster. The pressure of those years pushed Smith into a corner that nearly ended more than his company. A chunk of the early funding had been tied to his family's trust, the same inheritance he'd already poured into the business. When the money got desperate, documents were submitted to a bank that, prosecutors later alleged, carried forged signatures of his relatives. Smith was indicted. He faced federal charges. And his own board of directors, watching the losses pile up and the founder under criminal investigation, came close to removing him entirely. For a stretch, the man who invented the company was fighting to keep both his freedom and his job. In 1975, a jury acquitted him of the forgery charges. But the episode is a permanent part of the record. This wasn't a clean, heroic rescue. It was a young founder under impossible strain, making choices in the dark, some of which landed him in a courtroom. The honest version of the FedEx story includes that courtroom. It's part of what makes the survival remarkable. Not because everything was noble, but because the company came within inches of dying in a dozen different ways, financial and legal both. And then, almost quietly, the thing Smith had bet everything on finally started to do what he said it would. The rescue wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was the slow, grinding arrival of the one thing the company had always needed: volume. Word spread among the businesses that mattered most, the ones shipping urgent, high-value things. Computer parts, medical supplies, legal documents that had to be somewhere by morning or a deal collapsed. For those customers, Federal Express wasn't expensive. It was a bargain. A grounded factory waiting on a single part lost far more in a day than overnight shipping cost. So the packages came, not 186 anymore, thousands a night, then tens of thousands. And here's the beautiful thing about the hub-and-spoke design. The more packages flowed through Memphis, the cheaper each one got to move. The system Smith built rewarded scale, and scale was finally arriving. Then the rules changed in his favor. Air cargo deregulation in the late 1970s freed the company to fly bigger planes on the routes it chose, instead of squeezing everything into those small Falcon jets. Federal Express bought real freighters. Suddenly, one aircraft could carry what used to take many. The cost per package fell again. Every force that had been working against Smith, the losses, the limits, the doubt, began to reverse. The machine he'd designed on paper years earlier was, at last, running the way the math always promised it would. In 1975, the books finally turned. After bleeding cash for nearly its entire existence, after the grounded fleet, the oil shock, the courtroom, the blackjack table, Federal Express posted its first profit. It was small, a few $1,000,000, but it meant everything. Because it proved the one thing every skeptic had denied. The idea worked. Not as a theory in a college paper, not as a beautiful diagram, as a real running business that took in more than it spent. Think about how close it came. A few different decisions, a few worse weeks, and the company simply ceases to exist. And with it, the entire model for how urgent freight moves around the planet. The professor's note, real or not, said it couldn't be done. The banks said it couldn't be done. For 3 brutal years, the bank account agreed with them. And then one quarter, the math finally tipped. From that first modest profit, the line essentially never looked back. The company that had begged pilots to pay for fuel was about to become one of the most important logistics operations on Earth. And it was just getting started. By the end of the 1970s, the Memphis hub had a nickname, the Super Hub. Every night it became one of the strangest sights in American industry. Around midnight, planes from across the country descended on Memphis in a tight, choreographed wave. Hundreds of thousands of packages flooded into a sorting facility the size of a small city. Workers and machines raced against the clock to read every label, route every parcel, and reload every plane, all in a few hours of darkness. Then, before sunrise, the planes lifted off again, scattering back to deliver by morning. The whole operation ran on a single promise. And in 1978, the company turned that promise into one of the most famous advertising lines ever written. When it absolutely positively has to be there overnight, that sentence did something rare. It changed how people spoke. Customers stopped saying they would ship a package, they said they would FedEx it. The company name became a verb, the ultimate proof that a product has become the category itself. Nobody had to explain what it meant. Overnight delivery wasn't a luxury anymore, it was an expectation, woven into how business got done. The grounded fleet of 1973 was now the clockwork heart of American commerce, beating once a night over a runway in Tennessee. And the world was about to reshape itself around it. Here's what most people miss about the FedEx story. Smith didn't just build a successful company. He built an assumption that the entire modern economy now rests on. Think about how much of the world depends on getting things fast. A factory that holds almost no inventory because the parts it needs arrive exactly when required. A hospital that can summon a rare drug overnight. A small business in a tiny town that can sell to anyone anywhere and ship it the next day. None of that works without reliable, fast, long-distance delivery. And the hub-and-spoke blueprint Smith proved in Memphis became the template the whole industry copied. Today, Federal Express moves on the order of millions of packages every single day. It operates one of the largest cargo airlines on the planet, with hundreds of aircraft and hundreds of thousands of employees, generating tens of billions of dollars a year. When you order something online and watch it arrive in a day, you are living inside the world Smith sketched in that college paper. The competitors that followed, the e-commerce giants that built their own versions, the whole expectation of next-day everything, all of it traces back to a single, stubborn argument. That if you controlled the entire journey and routed everything through one hub, you could promise something nobody else could. And then keep that promise every single night. It would be easy to end on the triumph and leave it there. But the honest ledger has entries on both sides. The early years were built on gambles that should not have worked. Betting reserves on a card table is not a strategy. It's a symptom of how close to the edge the company lived. The legal cloud over that period was real, and the business that emerged drove relentlessly on cost. For decades, much of the ground delivery network ran on independent contractors rather than employees. A model that cut costs and sparked years of disputes and lawsuits over how those drivers were treated and classified. The same machine that delivers the world's urgent packages has also been a hard, demanding place to work. Smith himself was a complicated figure, a decorated Marine who served 2 tours in Vietnam, a brilliant systems thinker, and a man who by his own near misses almost lost everything more than once. The point isn't to tarnish the achievement, it's to see it clearly. Built from nothing doesn't mean built without cost. The real story is more interesting than a hero myth, because real people, under real pressure, built something genuinely new and paid for it in ways the highlight reel never shows. Go back, one last time, to that office in Memphis. July 1973. $5,000 in the bank. A fuel bill that could ground everything. A young man with a college paper, a fleet he couldn't afford, and an idea the whole world had told him was impossible. He was 3 days from the end. Fred Smith died in 2025 after building that desperate company into one of the arteries of the global economy. The fleet that almost never flew now lifts off every night, in 100 countries, carrying the medicine and the parts and the ordinary packages that hold modern life together. The professor's grade, whether it was real or not, became a footnote. The Blackjack Hand became a legend. But the thing that actually saved Federal Express was simpler and harder than either. A bet that the math was right, held on to through 3 years that should have broken it. He didn't disrupt an industry, he built one. From a paper nobody believed, and a bank account that should have been empty. If a story about building something impossible is worth your time, subscribe. There are plenty more where this came from.